Seja bem-vindo e bem-vinda ao nosso canal. Este evento é organizado pelo Escritório da UNESCO no Brasil. Ele discutirá questões relevantes para todos e cobrirá uma das 5 áreas do mandato da UNESCO: educação, ciências naturais, ciências humanas e sociais, cultura, comunicação e informação. Contudo, esclarecemos que as indicações de nomes e a apresentação do material ao longo deste evento não implicam a manifestação de qualquer opinião por parte da UNESCO a respeito da condição jurídica de qualquer país, território, cidade, região ou de suas autoridades, tampouco da delimitação de suas fronteiras ou limites. Assim, as ideias e as opiniões expressas neste evento são a dos participantes e não refletem obrigatoriamente as da UNESCO, nem comprometem a organização. Acompanhe os canais da UNESCO para outros eventos e ações da organização. Neste evento são a dos participantes e não refletem obrigatoriamente as da UNESCO, nem comprometem a organização. Acompanhe os canais da UNESCO para outros eventos e ações da organização.
Good afternoon here in Lisbon. And good morning in Brazil. It's a pleasure to have all of you with us today for this lecture of the series on the futures of education. And I want to thank Caixa Geral de Depósitos, which is helping us in the diffusion and in the organization of this series of lectures. And today I have the huge pleasure to present Gert Biesta. We all know him very well, both here in Portugal and in Brazil. I know that there are lots and lots of expectation and to hear the lecture by Gert Biesta on the future of education in the impulse society, why schools and teachers matter. And I will give immediately the floor to Gert Biesta, thanking him very, very much for your kindness, for your generosity, for your availability to be with us here in Lisbon and in Brazil and around the world. By the end of the lecture by Gert Biesta, we'll have the time to take 2 or 3 questions from the audience. I will ask you to present your questions in English, because we are in the English channel and another channel is providing the translation into Portuguese by UNESCO Brazil. So if you want to ask questions, please do it in English at the end of the lecture. Gert, thank you very much.
Okay.
The floor is yours.
Good, thanks very much. Good afternoon and good morning for people online. It's an honor to be here, but I'm also a bit nervous, particularly if Antonio's right and everyone already knows everything I've ever written or said or thought, because then I wonder, will I be able to say anything new? But even if nothing that I present is new, maybe it's still nice to hear it coming out of my mouth. I want to speak about the future of education, and I want to be very clear from the start that for me the future of education is not the future of learning. And I will say a bit more about that throughout the talk. It's an important point to make because somewhere around this time there is a meeting organized by the OECD in Singapore, which is called the Future of Education, And the first theme is the future of learning. And for me, the two really need to be kept apart. In some of my work that also has been translated into Portuguese, I've been arguing against what I call the learnification of education, the idea that everything we can say about education can and should be captured in terms of learners and learning, which is a big trend, but for me it's a problem. So one of the challenges I have set for myself, but I think it's important for the field of education, not just the field of scholarship, but also the field of practice, is how can we keep a focus on education and also on the beautiful work and the risky work of education. And for that, I want to introduce a little device. Any of you who have a philosophical background may know this. Occam's razor, proposed by William of Ockham long ago, where he said plurality should not be posited without necessity. And what he meant by that is don't make things more difficult than they need to be. But in Latin it sounds perfect. I want to introduce a similar razor, which I want to call Biesta's razor. This is just a Google Translate in Latin. But the suggestion I want to do is that education only has a point for those things that cannot happen without education. And that sounds almost obvious, but I want to work with this little razor halfway my talk in order to see whether we can get as close to education as possible. So when we talk about the future of education, which is a big topic, I was talking to someone who wants to do a project on this, and she says, when I look at all the discussions and all the conferences about education, 99% is about the future of education, so there's definitely something there. One answer I encounter quite a lot is that people say in the past we had schools, and sometimes people then say we had traditional schools and traditional education. And what we need in the future is to move from traditional schools to powerful, flexible learning environments. You may have heard that phrase. Maybe you even think it's a good idea, but let's see if we can probe that a little. So what I hear is that people say we need these environments in which learners are in the center, where they pursue personalized learning trajectories and learn ideally from real-life situations. And the reason for making that point is to say if that's how we organize education, then students will acquire useful knowledge and skills that will allow them to adapt quickly to a world that's rapidly changing. And you'll probably recognize some of these phrases. And in that, the future is also positioned in a very particular way as something that we cannot know what it will be about. Teachers, in such a view of the future, become quite marginal. They are, for example, named as facilitators of this learning. And you can play with these ideas like the teacher used to be a sage on the stage, like what this looks like. And then people say, no, the teacher needs to become a guide on the side. And a friend of mine said, maybe the teacher needs to become a peer at the rear. And in the language of learning communities, then suddenly we are all the same. Now, my question is this a future we should be move towards? Is it a future we should desire? And my own answer to my own question, so that's easy if I can set the questions, I can also answer them, is that I would say no. If this is the future of education, then actually we are talking about a past that we struggled to get rid of. My example here has to do with these English words, and I don't know whether you know any of them: trappers, hurriers, thrusters, getters, breakers. these were the names for the work that children did in the mines. And here are some pictures of what that work was. And children are very convenient there because they are small, so they can go into the corners where there is still some coal to find, and children are cheap. But when you look at what happens here, I would say this is exactly an example of a very powerful learning environment where children learned quickly, where the children, just by doing the work, gained very useful knowledge and skills in real-life situations without teachers so that they could adapt quickly. So here you can probably see my problem with this view of a future of education. And the struggle to get away from that is a real and long and political struggle. When you look just at the history of children in the mines, you see in Britain, for example, that after a big report that found that children as young as 5 were doing shifts of 12 hours a day, finally politicians began to say something needs to change. So there came new legislation that, for example, said females should not be employed underground. Funnily enough, not because they couldn't do the work, but because they would wear trousers, and when it would get hot, they would take off their shirts, and that would have a negative influence on the boys and men. So that's emancipation for you. No child under 10 years old was allowed to be employed underground, and the children of the poor, they could still work underground from the age of 10. Now, if you put the whole question in that perspective, then you can actually say the school is not such a bad place. The school is actually a place of relief, a place that can offer protection. And in a little book I wrote in Dutch last year, I even suggest that we should understand the school again as a sanctuary. What's beautiful, and several authors have referred to that, is that the word school itself helps us here, because the Greek root of the word school actually means free time. Now nowadays we have very superficial ideas of what free time and freedom is, and we think free time is time to do just what you want to do. But I think there is something more precise and more interesting and important in this image, where you can say, what is free time? That is time that is not yet claimed by society, that is not yet claimed by the economy. You could say that is the time of the school, precisely the time we try to set free, for example, by getting children out of the mines and the factories. The time we give to the new generation so that they have a fair chance at arriving in the world, meeting the world, not in order to be immediately a productive laborer, and in meeting the world, also meeting themselves. And here somewhere you can begin to find a language about education as a right. School is then the time we try to set free and keep free, so that the new generation has an opportunity to explore, to figure out what is this world in which I have arrived? Who am I in relation to this world? Well, you can say we give the new generation an opportunity to try, to fail, to try again. And if you know your Samuel Beckett, you may recognize that he has this sentence, and then beautifully said, the ambition there is not to end up with perfection, but to fail better, which I think is such a beautiful phrase. So school is an important place and an important chunk of time, you could say, compared to the work of children in mines and factories. There are similar questions to ask about this idea. Should we make sure that children and young people gain useful knowledge? And here again, I go back to the history in Britain. William Lovett, who made a really interesting distinction between useful knowledge and what he called really useful knowledge. You can say, what is useful knowledge? That's precisely the knowledge you get when you get a training on the job. Knowledge to do your job, knowledge to be a good, nice, obedient citizen. Practical knowledge, practical skills. And what Lovett said is, if that's the only knowledge we make available to the new generation, we are missing something really important. The really useful knowledge that, for example, has to do with the question, who is in power and who is powerless? Why that is so? Why that is not a situation that should continue? Really useful knowledge, you could say, is critical knowledge and political knowledge, which you will not immediately get if you go straight into a work situation. Lovett, together with John Collins, was part of a movement, Chartism, in which they really said this is not just important for children and young people, but this has to do with all citizens in society. And they worked quite hard for what they call a plan for the education and improvement of the people, not in useful ways, but politically and socially. What is nice about their text, or an interesting historical detail, is that it was written in the Warwick prison, because these ideas were seen as very dangerous, for which people ought to be locked up. Third point, again, there is this image of the future of education that says if you have useful knowledge, then you will be able to adapt quickly to this rapidly changing world. But is that the knowledge or the only knowledge that is needed? One important thing is that changes in society are not natural forces. Unemployment is not a fact of nature, but is the result of very deliberate decisions in the economy, political decisions. So just to say that these changes happen and therefore we need to adapt, very quickly forget actually in whose interest these changes happen. The same with the future. On the one hand, you can say, yeah, the whole point of the future is that we do not know what the future will be like. But that doesn't mean that it becomes a black hole that we cannot say anything about. Core human challenges about sustainability, democracy, peace and care, we know that they will not go away because they are an aspect of the human condition. So to simply say we have no idea about the future and therefore need to prepare for anything misses important understandings of things that we do know will not go away in the future. And that also comes back to the question whether indeed our task as human beings is to flexibly move with everything that happens, or whether the situations we find ourselves in actually require that we resist, that we say no. That is not a matter of knowledge and skills, which is often the phrase you will find in talks about the future of education, but it's a matter of judgment, which is a far more difficult thing to work on. Here's a little vignette I've used in my work. You may recognize this woman. This is Rosa Parks, who boarded a bus in Lincoln, Alabama in 1953, I think. And in the bus were these signs, white forward, colored rear. And the story is that when Rosa Parks was asked to move to the back of the bus, she didn't do that. Now, if your educational mind is completely, how shall I put it, colonized by PISA or by basic skills, then you can say, here we have a big problem because there is a very clear message, but Rosa Parks is not decoding the message. So she needs to go back to school. This is a case of educational failure. But of course, the point here is not a lack of the ability to decode, which in some political discussions about education is all that policymakers say about the whole question of reading. The point here is that Rosa Parks was perfectly able to read the message, but that she also was able to judge what was happening here, make up her own mind, say no, resist it, and was aware and willing also to undergo the consequences of her action. Which shows in a very quick example, but I really like the power of this vignette, that reading is not a cognitive skill, it is a political act, which needs to have a place in education as well. So these are some questions or some nuances against this idea that the future of education should be this of learning in real life in order to get the useful knowledge. And in that, it makes the case that the school is actually a very important place that is not the same as real everyday life or the life of work. But then there is a big question, again, I think, for the future of education and for all who in some way have an interest or role to play. Do we, and we is a difficult word, but I'll use it with a little bit of hesitation. Do we in our time still have time for this time of the school? And here I want to refer to a book that has inspired me a lot by an American author, Paul Roberts, and the book is called The Impulse Society. And the message of the book can already be found in the subtitle of the British edition. The American edition has an even more, I think, disturbing subtitle. The British subtitle is, "What is wrong with getting what we want?" And what the book shows is what goes wrong if we organize our collective life just on the principle of getting what we want. And it shows the, can say, devastating implications if we have societies that only act on impulse and the immediate satisfaction of impulses. That's the idea of the impulse society. A society, you can say, based on the logic of instant gratification. And that's part of the subtitle of the American edition of the book. This is a really key principle in modern economies, where we have economic systems and systems of production that, of course, know that many people in the world already have far too much stuff. And you can say then companies should close and should stop selling stuff. But of course, out of this problematic idea that economies need to grow, there is always the search, how can economies still grow? And one part of the analysis that Roberts does in his book is that he shows the way in which economies still try to grow is by constantly pushing new desires in our direction. The nice example is Apple. I would claim Apple doesn't sell mobile phones. What Apple sells is the desire for a new mobile phone. That's their business model. And that desire they sell for free, you could say. And they just hope that many people buy into that desire so that they can go from iPhone, where are we? I think we are at 15 or something like that, and it goes on and on and on. But the same problem is also the problem of populist politics, where politicians say, if you vote for me, I will give you everything you desire. And of course, when we think about that, we know that it's not possible. But if it's possible to take out the thinking and just go to the impulse, then these become very powerful messages. And therefore, with the idea of the impulse society, you can say we have societal and economic and political logics, where the time and place and the institutions that we used to have in order to help each other to take a critical look at all these desires and to figure out which desires are worth pursuing and which not. That possibility to ponder that question is more and more being pushed out. And I think when you look at the logic of social media, they actually do the same. I still find it actually quite objectionable that these are called social media, because they are just advertising technologies. Social media is as a label an ideology. In such a society, you can say that the need for the school becomes actually more urgent if we understand the school educationally, so not as this flexible learning environment, but as a place for an educational moment where precisely this question, is what I desire or what arrives in me as a desire, is that what I should be desiring, where that question is on the table and gets the time and the attention and ways to work with it. That this is a central and maybe the central educational question came to me when I was reading the beautiful work of the fantastic scholar Philippe Mérieux. We spoke about him over lunch, where in one of his books, Pédagogie, le devoir de résister, the duty of education is actually to resist, where he says all educational work is concerned with the difficult task of helping children and young people to disconnect themselves from the logic of desires. That is at the heart of the educational work. And why is that there? Because I think that that is what it means for education to have an emancipatory quality. There are different traditions of emancipation. There are traditions that look very much to society and what is outside of us. But I think this analysis and what Roberts writes about the impulse society shows that the whole question of emancipation has ended up inside of all of us. And you can say the educational challenge of emancipation is whether we can disconnect from our desires, not become, you can say, a slave or object of desires. We need the time of the school for that, because many other societal forces, capitalist economy, populist politics, are not at all interested in that question. They want people to run behind their desires and not ask difficult questions. And therefore you can say those kind of modalities of capitalism and politics, they are interested in our infantility and not our grown-upness. So they go to the heart of the educational matter. Mérieux writes about it beautifully. I write a bit more clumsy, where I argue that education needs to be obstinate, has a duty to say no, and in that way to reconnect with society in a different way. So that brings me to this little razor, if you still remember it, where I said education only has a point for those things that cannot happen without education. And I'm sort of halfway in my presentation, so I'll have a look at this and then I'll make some further steps into another direction for education and its future. So the conclusion I draw from what I've presented so far is that I would say if we want powerful learning environments focused on useful knowledge, flexible adaptation in this apparently rapidly changing world, we don't need education. We actually don't need the school. So if that's the future of education, at the very same time, it gives education away. That's my worry with that image. Sometimes I say, also to provoke, if people want to learn, they should just get a job. Forget about school, because you can learn an awful lot in work. But of course, precisely the educational things, it's far more unlikely that you will learn them there. In my more radical moments, I would even say, if you are looking for a powerful learning environment where you learn a lot of useful things, join a criminal gang. That's the best example of that. Or just connect your children to algorithms that the tech industry is already providing also to schools, where they can do their own personalized things and be tested personally. Again, I would say that's not education. Because what distinguishes education, first of all, I would say, the presence of a teacher. Learning you can do by yourself or in all kinds of systems. Education requires at least two parties, a student and a teacher. That's distinctive of education. And in education, the teacher should not be there to facilitate what may be happening anyway. The teacher should be essential rather than accidental to what happens. And this is the idea in this razor, where I say, can we capture those dimensions of education where we can really say, yes, the teacher is essential rather than accidental. I will try to look into that, and you need to judge whether where I end up is successful or not. But for me it means, and it's very helpful, that if we want to keep the focus on education, it always helps to look from the angle of the teacher, actually, not from the angle of learning or the learner. But there's another little problem we need to bump over before we can get there, because already for centuries and millennia, many people are quite uncomfortable with teachers and teaching. I call this, just for the fun of it, didactophobia, the fear of teaching. And I can find it already in Socrates, who actually says, oh, wait a minute, I'm not teaching, I'm just asking some interesting questions, but don't call me a teacher. I'll be very careful in the Portuguese language, but Paulo Freire also has a degree of didactophobia, where he says education must begin with solving the teacher-student contradiction. He thinks that the teacher in some way is the problem, and that we all should become simultaneously teachers and students. In Germany in the 1960s and 70s, there was actually a movement that went further and not just said we need to get rid of teachers, but they even said we need to get rid of education altogether. Anti-pedagogic. This book, Studies for the Abolishment of Education. And I found a nice poster, if you read German, that says Erziehen verboten. You are not allowed to educate in this zone. Can you imagine that? Well, maybe when you look at social media, it says something like, don't ask the difficult questions about what we should be desiring and what not. Now, you can say the uneasiness about teaching has to do with the fact that teaching carries this image of control. And some people really like that. They say, yes, we need to have more control in classrooms. We have need to have more effective instruction so that we can produce all these measurable learning outcomes and put our country #1 in PISA, if that's your obsession. But they also say we need to make sure that teachers have authority again. Others, and I'm more comfortable with this part of the spectrum, understand that control is precisely what education should not aim for, because the encounter between the generations is never there to take the life of children and young people away from them, but precisely to give them a fair chance at their own existence as subject in the world. So the fear of teaching is an understandable response when we see that education constantly veers towards control. But it's a problematic response. It has something to do with what you can call this throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Because what I've seen, and maybe you recognize that, is that the main response to teaching as control, and when I look at education systems, there is actually an awful lot of teaching that is enacted as control, has been to say if we can get rid of the teacher and turn towards learning, then we have overcome this problem. That's the idea of the learnification of education. What it does is to say we can solve the problem of teaching as control by moving the teachers out of the equation. But this is my question. Can teaching only exist as control? And is it really true that learning is a matter of freedom? And if you know my work, there must be some people in the room who know where this may be going. I have big questions about both. I don't think that teaching can only exist as a matter of control, but I also think that learning nowadays is not a matter of freedom at all, and I've given some historical examples for that. What remains remarkable in many of these discussions is the constant forgetting of the third option. Again, Antonio and I were talking about it, and you mentioned the title of the book, The Third Bank of the River, where you said the third bank is the river itself, and if we go to one of the banks, we are not where we should be. So there is a remarkable absence of a third option that actually understands that teaching can exist on the side of emancipation and freedom. And that's the kind of teaching I think we need to recover and rediscover for a very different future of education. Of course, that raises the question, what is teaching? A tremendously big question, but one scholar who has brought this back to the most basic insight is Klaus Prange, German scholar, who says, what is teaching? Teaching is pointing. That's all there is. And in his Radical Moments he says, and it's nothing more than that. Because what happens in teaching, in the form of teaching, is always that the teacher points to something and tries to capture the attention of the students onto this something. Just as I'm doing now with a technology called PowerPoint, which is interesting. One interesting phrase is to say what then happens in teaching as pointing is that teaching is the art of redirecting someone's attention. In German, beautifully, die Kunst der Umlenkung des Blicks, the art of redirecting someone's attention. Now, this sounds very simple, but precisely here we can find a moment where teaching is essential rather than accidental, because we can all direct our attention, but I cannot redirect my own attention. I cannot say to myself, hey, you're always looking there, you should be looking there. That's my attention. But if someone comes to you and say, have you ever thought of looking there? Have you ever thought of spending time there? That is a teacherly moment for which you need someone else. Primer very nicely says when we point, it's not just that we point in a particular direction and to the thing that deserves attention, but he says in pointing we always also point back to students. So he says pointing is a double gesture. You have a look there, you go there, you spend time there. Pointing is a remarkable technology, you could say. It tries to focus attention, and when you look at educational technology going back to the blackboard or the classroom or anything you can think of, you can always see that these are ways to help to focus and keep attention. You can even say that teaching demands attention, but of course as teachers we know is that we cannot enforce the attention of our students. We cannot control their attention. Even if you would go very far with that, there is a point where the attention is still the student's own attention. Now what happens when teaching is about bringing something to the attention of our students is that things are being given. And I've written in my work about this question of the gifts of teaching, again in order to find examples of where teaching is essential rather than accidental. The curriculum is one. What is the curriculum? It has to do with giving students what they didn't ask for. For me, this is one of the most important things of being an educator. Not to give students what they ask for, but to give what they didn't ask for or weren't looking for. First of all, because students may not even know that they could be looking for it or asking for it. Our work is always to open doors, particularly where students didn't even know that there is a door. And each time we open a door to the world, we also open a door to the self. Wolfgang Klafki's understandings of curriculum. The second point, and it's a complicated idea, so I'll jump over it quite quickly, is the insight that teaching is double truth-giving. A lot of people say, well, teaching is a question of the transmission of knowledge, or we give students information. That's not our work. We have the far more difficult work to do, to pull students into a frame within which the information can begin to speak, within which the information can begin to make sense. This is still my frustration from secondary school, where my mathematics teacher was really good at mathematics, but I was on the outside of mathematics, and he never managed to pull me inside of what he was doing there. Teacher essential. And then you can say, and we call that pedagogy, each time we try to attract the attention of our students and also point in the direction of the students and say, hey, have you ever considered paying attention to that? We also do an appeal to them. In the sense, we knock on the door of our students and we ask, is anyone there? You can say that's the Rosa Parks moment in teaching, where Rosa Parks said, I understand perfectly what I'm reading here. I perfectly understand the laws of our society. But now, at this point, I no longer want to go with that flow. A moment of resistance. Teaching, therefore, understood in this way, actually points at freedom. It calls students to their own attention. There is no point in saying in students, repeat after me. It's to say, here is something to attend to, but then it's over to you. Not to just push a button and say like or dislike. That's not what we should be wanting from our students. Not this neoliberal freedom of shopping or just having an opinion, but actually the freedom to meet the world that arrives in your life and to ask what the world may be asking of you, rather than just what you would like to see happening there. That is a pedagogy of attention, and there I'm quite inspired by Simone Weil, who says, yes, our first job is to create attention, but of course that's not where it stops. Once something is in our field of attention, there is important intellectual work to do. What I like about Weil is that she always says, intellectual work needs to be done with humility. And ultimately that needs to come to a point of discernment, judgment for each student to ask, now that I'm here, how will I continue my life from here? In that, the third element is really important, because the fear of teaching comes out of this idea that educational relationships are just between teachers and students. If we have that picture, then it's really difficult for the teacher to be there, because either the teacher is an authority figure, and that's not where teachers want to be, or they have to move completely and say, I actually have nothing to offer. So the beauty of pointing is to understand that there are always three elements in the room: a teacher, a student, and something. And that the work of the teacher is to attend to what is there. And with a very big word, you can call that the world. And if there is any authority in education, and I think there should be, it's not the authority of the teacher. That's where didactophobia is right. But it's the authority of the world, because the world is not just what we want it to be. The world puts limits and limitations on what we can do there. That's what I wanted to share with you about the future of education. And maybe I want to change the question a little by saying, rather than to talk about the future of education, I think the deeper question is there a future for education? Or is education itself being pushed out in all kinds of views about the future that miss the educational point? For that we need the school, but not as an instrument to do all kind of stuff for society, but actually as an institution. Because I think what institutions do, or used to do, is to help everyone precisely to stay in a relationship with desires rather than to just run behind your desires. The school precisely has the time that makes that possible. The school, therefore, that I would say should be close to society so that it can be open to the world. And for this, for a future for education, we need teachers who are not afraid of teaching and who understand that they have something to give, but that what they have to give is not control, but the invitation to attend to the world. And that's in my little book, World-Centered Education. I was talking about the subtitle. Rather than to say a view for the future, I actually call it a view for the present. Why is all this important? Also because teaching should stop. And this is the beautiful sentence from Bertolt Brecht I like to conclude with. Every teacher should not just know how to start teaching, but must also learn how to stop teaching when the time comes. That's a difficult art. Only a few are able, when the time is right, to allow reality to take their place. As teachers, we are there temporarily, but at the end of the day, it's over to our students and their life in the world. Thanks very much for attending to what I try to bring to your attention.
Thank you, Gert. Perfect timing, perfect lecture, perfect ideas. Thank you very much for your presentation, for your provocations, and for your thought, which is very, very important for us. I believe we have time for 2 or 3 very quick questions. We don't have many time, but we have like 10 minutes, more or less. If someone wants to ask a question, please feel free to do it. Otherwise, I have lots of questions, but I would prefer that questions came from the audience. Do we have a microphone?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hello. So I'm a teacher from movement, dance, and physical education, and I'm searching about body and education. So the short question is how you can see body in this structure. This is my question.
The simple answer, I think, is that attention is a matter of, you can say, bodies in space. And in that sense, attention is not something internal or cognitive, but it has to do also with physical turning of your eyes, for example, but even the way in which you can attend in other ways than just through your eyes. To pay attention with your eyes closed is already a very different experience and an important one as well. But at the same time, I know there is a lot of enthusiasm about sort of embodied thinking and embodied cognition. And I came across a beautiful phrase that I think we also need there. I came across it in a little book by Leonardo Boff, who says human beings are of course embodied, but more importantly, we are spiritualized beings. We have a soul, we have an inner life. And I think for me that's important as well, to say we do not attend as organisms, we attend as human beings with a self and an insight, and that layer is really important as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Gert. Another question over there, please.
Hello, thank you for the conference, Gert. I would like to ask you to go deeper into the difference between society and the world. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. It looks like a play with words. You can say this is all just playing with words, but for me there is something really important there. Because there's also a tradition that simply says education needs to be a closed sphere. It shouldn't let any influences in, because otherwise we begin already to corrupt children. This is what you can read sort of in a superficial reading of Rousseau's Émile, for example. Out of that we get quite naive ideas about education that say, oh, if children can just develop and grow, everything will be fine. And I see this in scholarship, where people get very excited about flourishing, for example. I also see it in schools that says, if you send your child to our school, we'll make sure that they can develop all their talents. And then I get very worried, because if I honestly look at all my talents, I also have talents to do the most horrible things. So that's sort of in the background towards an important dimension there as well. So you can say, on the one hand, school needs to be a protected and protecting environment, precisely for all the societal forces that are not interested at all in our grown-upness, but want us to remain infantile, just immediately click to our desires and never asking, is what is here as a desire, is that what I should be desiring? But that is not there for individual development. That is there for our human existence individually and collectively. That takes place in the world. And therefore you can say precisely to put that question on the table, is what is being desired or what is presented to us as a desire, is that what we should be desiring? That for me opens up an existence in the world. You can say a political existence in the literal sense of existing in the polis, in political communities together. And therefore that image for me is quite important in order to think very differently about education in its relationship to society. But it is tricky because we constantly need to ask, so where is society and where is world? You can say society constantly manifests itself as an impulse society. And there you can say education has a task to push back, because if we just have an impulse society, we don't give the new generation a fair chance at their own life.
Thank you. Yes, here, please.
Thank you for your talk. I have a question about the role of teachers and how might we, as a society, as teachers, as parents, stop the market forces that are eroding the role of the teacher and removing the teacher from education, and therefore just focus on that learning. If you've got any suggestions or thoughts to share. Thank you.
It's an important question, but the answer is difficult. Because, there's a temptation to say, well, many teachers are just stupid, and if they understand what really matters, then we're all fine. That would be a big insult to teachers. I don't believe teachers are stupid. Nor do I believe that my students are stupid when they say strange things. The responsibility immediately comes back to me as a teacher, that if a student says something where I think, why do you say that? I need to ask myself, have I brought enough to the attention of the student so that the student has a possibility to see differently in relation to that? So for me, that's also the importance of the intellectual work around education, to say, can we help each other to see differently, ask different questions, and also stay in touch with the memory of our profession. I was at a conference last weekend where actually one of the concerns that was expressed, that many people think that this situation of teaching for PISA and measurable learning outcomes, that is what education is. If you don't have a memory of that, education can be something else. It becomes difficult to even perceive a problem. So somewhere there, I think there is, this kind of work needed that takes up this question of the future of education in a very different way. Not to say how can we even move faster to this sort of perfect thing on the horizon, but to say, is in the future of education, is there still a future for education as something that understands that education has to do with our existence as human beings. So at one level, it's quite a big puzzle. At another level, it's also, how shall I put it, it's more easy maybe than what people sometimes think. I grew up in the Netherlands, and Netherlands is very much a hierarchical control society where someone is always in charge of someone else, and if you want to do something, you need to look up. And I mentioned this over coffee this morning, this beautiful English saying that says, don't ask for permission, ask for forgiveness. And since I moved to Britain 25 years ago, this has been the motto of my life. We should just push. We should just try and see what happens. Because if we begin by asking for permission, we will always be framed within what is already conceivable. And in that sense, things will not change. And this is what I try to do in my own teaching as well. To do what I think that needs to be done, and in that I go against all kind of systems also in British higher education, in order to see what happens. And then much more is possible than what people often think. So it's also the very practical work of pushing back. I enjoy doing that on my own. Other people enjoy doing that collectively, and I think there is value in both.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. First of all, thank you so much. Based on your research, I'm doing a project about teacher agency, more specifically about the role of teacher agency between the perception of the context and motivation. I would like to ask you what you think it's the importance of teacher agency in that type of school that you're talking about. Thank you.
How shall I respond to that? So teacher agency is a bit an odd notion, because you can say, yeah, if it's there, it's there. If it's not there, how do you get there? So it doesn't help you in becoming more agentic. So it depends, for example, on what you understand that it is to be a teacher. So what I worked on in this talk is to say, can we really understand the difference between where teaching is essential and where it's accidental? And can you work with that in your practice? Now, if you work with that, I think you display a degree of agency because, as they say beautifully in English, it allows you to cut through the crap. You can immediately say, look, this is nonsense. If you call me a facilitator, then that's not the job I was hired for. So I think for me to have a language and maybe also a theoretical understanding that you can begin to see what matters and what doesn't matter is important there. And therefore teachers need to keep talking also about what they are doing, but with, yeah, precision. Let's call it that.
Thank you. One last question or not? Do we finish? Okay. If not, thank you. Thank you very much again, Gert. It was wonderful to have you with us here in Lisbon in this series. Thank you very much also to Caixa Geral de Depósitos for supporting these lectures. A great thank you again to UNESCO Brazil, which is broadcasting it for all over the world, not only to Brazil, but all over the world. And finally, to invite all of you to be with us on the last lecture of this series, the lecture by Rapadurai on May 3rd, here at Culturgest, where Rapadurai will talk about discipline and disciplines in the plural. It will be the last lecture of this cycle. We are all invited. Again, thank you very much. Hope to have you with us on May 3rd here at Culturgest. Thank you. Thanks a lot.